Paranormal Uproar, submitted by A.M. Francis 09. Back in 2010, I was 19 years old. I had a group of friends, and a large majority of them were male with very few females. The ones that did hang out were country girls, or were more tomboy, if you will. We all had a super tough exterior and took very little shit off of anything or anyone around us. In the fall of that year, one of those girls, let's call her Rachel, wound up pregnant, and she just wasn't ready. Being pro-choice myself, I was willing to give her the needed mental support she had requested of me. Rachel stressed to me that this pregnancy was a big mistake, especially with the person that got her that way. But who am I to judge? A few days later, she went to her doctor and received the medications needed to abort the fetus. She asked me to stay with her that night because she lived alone and she was scared in the case of something happening. I was happy to oblige, and when I arrived at Rachel's, the father of the child and her own stepfather were present. They were aware of her choice and had brought her some things to make the evening more comfortable. Both left shortly after they wished her luck, and we quickly settled in. She took the medication and then hopped in the shower while I got more comfortable on her bed. She had no more than stepped out of the shower when we heard a huge racket outside. Her pit bull Diesel sounded like he was in a brawl. She lived on a farm, so we figured a few coyotes had come up out of the hills, but we ran outside, pistols drawn and equipped with flashlights. We saw nothing. Diesel was in his pen and wasn't making a sound. We heard some upset cattle on the farm next door, but it didn't seem like our problem. But that was the first of off occurrences of that evening. Anyway, we paid no mind and went back into the house. We fell asleep watching one of our favorite horror films, I Spit on Your Grave. Well, the remake, not the original. The weird stuff began with Rachel. She woke me up 1:15 a.m. She was pale and slightly frantic, and I asked her what the deal was. She said she'd been laying there in silence, unable to move. She could see the TV on and could see me laying next to her sleeping, but couldn't make a noise to get my attention. I told her it was sleep paralysis and she'd be fine. It's happened to me here and there throughout my life. She told me leading up to the paralysis, though, she had a dream of her father. She lived in his home and he left it to her when he died. She explained that he was sitting at the dining room table and he kept saying the words, "bad medicine." I was too tired to interpret a dream, so we both fell back asleep. And then it was my turn. I could see the DVD title screen, sleep paralysis. I couldn't move, but I knew what it was. I still tried yelling for her, but silent screams left my lungs. Then, as fast as it started, I was released from my mattress prison. I took a deep breath, collected my thoughts, told myself it was just a dream, and I fell back asleep. At 3 a.m., I was awoken by the bathroom door. Rachel had a king-size bed and a double-wide trailer. There wasn't much room for the bed, so the bathroom door rested against the foot of the mattress. It was like someone had moved the door to the shut position and then slammed it against my foot that was hanging off the end of the bed. I jumped up. She had a black German shepherd and he was pacing the floor and panting. He knew something wasn't right. And just to explain what I was seeing, her bedroom door was shut, but it didn't lock. She always pushed a pair of boots up against it. When the door was open, there was a straight shot down the hall just past the dining room. Rachel sat up too and looked at me. Before she could speak, there was a noise down the hall. It sounded like footsteps. Then it sounded like footsteps sprinting. Something started from the end of the hallway and hauled ass towards her bedroom door and hit it. We heard a crack, and it bounced off the pair of boots blocking entry. Rachel told me she knew something lived with her, but it hadn't been this active in a while. Hey, thanks for the heads up. She knew her father watched over her. But she was fairly convinced that something more malevolent was there as well. You think? She yelled at it to leave her alone and then fell back asleep. As hard as I tried to do the same, I couldn't. I just lay there for the next 4 hours listening to the sound of a small object bouncing on the kitchen floor. It was like a kid was picking up a marble and letting it drop over and over. Rachel left the house at 6 for work, and I was there alone trying to get myself ready for work as well, but I couldn't shake the feeling of something standing behind me. I wanted out of that house. I locked the front door, brushed my teeth in the driveway with a bottle of water I found in my truck, and then hauled ass down the road. When I was safe at work, I texted our friend Matthew, who had passed out drunk on the couch on more than one occasion. I told him what had happened, and according to him, a blanket was torn off him and thrown across the room in the middle of the night. He lay there stunned, trying to convince himself to stand up and go get it back. Once he did, the German Shepherd crawled up on the couch with him and buried his face. Matthew could hear a group of people whispering in that dark, empty room. He then explained that he heard what sounded like a solid object being bounced on the kitchen floor, as well as pans rattling in the cabinets. After that, I wouldn't go into that house alone. Rachel's married and lives somewhere else now. The trailer was sold to a family of 8 and taken to a new location. I often wonder if they ever hear the footsteps or the bouncing sounds. Whatever was there that night didn't like what she was doing, and it wanted her to know that it was bad medicine. So, hey, creepy double-wide, let's never see each other again. The Box, submitted by Bick Roller. This all started when my grandmother passed away when I was 22 years old. I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' house growing up, as they didn't live too far from my parents, and they acted as babysitters all the time. I loved being over there, and always had a good time with them, and was devastated when my grandmother passed away at a pretty young age of only 73 years old. When she passed, it was decided that my grandfather was going to sell the house and move into a country home they owned a few hours away. It made sense, as it was a smaller place that was easier to maintain, and I think it was easier on him knowing he was leaving a place behind that he had lived in for the majority of his life with my grandmother, and there were probably way too many memories there. So my family pitched in to help get things packed up. We were selling things at a garage sale and just getting the place ready for selling. I was in the basement, and I found a little canister, kind of like what Altoids come in today. It was sealed with wax, and it had a piece of paper on the outside that said, "Do not disturb." It was kind of up in the eaves of the basement, and I knew that this was not my grandmother's handwriting. I'm not really sure who wrote it, but I also didn't want to disturb anything, so I figured it would be a nice surprise whoever bought the house, and so I put it back where I found it. My grandmother had left a bunch of stuff for all of us grandchildren and my uncle and father. She had specific items on a list in a little safe, and she wanted us all to have those after she passed. During the process of going through all the stuff, we found most of the items, put things in boxes, and marked them with our names. My grandfather, as sad and heartbroken as he was, got a kick out of seeing some of the things my grandmother had held on to us for us to have. He would tell us stories about remembering when she got those things, and it was a really cool couple of days supporting my grandfather and reminiscing. My uncle had come from out of state with one of my cousins, and they were staying in the house helping out. When the weekend of the huge garage sale came, my mom, father, sister, and I spent 2 days getting rid of as much stuff as we could, and then donated the rest to Goodwill. The house sold pretty fast, and I remember it was only on the market for like a week. I got my grandfather's stuff together pretty quickly. Before it even sold, we had moved most of his stuff out to the country place, and he was settling in out there as my parents were handling most of the real estate transactions. When we finally sold the house, obviously my grandfather came back to take care of it, but in the meantime, we had all taken our personal boxes home with us. I put mine in my closet and didn't really think about it. And as a hard-ass 22-year-old, it was hard for me to admit my feelings. Inside, I was crushed because my grandmother meant so much to me, and I just wanted to go about my days without having to think about her constantly. About a week after the closing of the house, weird things started happening around my house. I'm not talking the typical I couldn't find my car keys where I left them and suddenly found them in the sugar bowl kind of thing. I'm talking furniture rearranging itself on its own, entire cabinets switching their contents on their own in the middle of the day when no one was home, and very strange noises at night. It's hard to explain, but some of them were like an elongated trumpet or trombone note mixed with a freight train. It wasn't that loud, but it was just enough that you could hear it, and that's when all the weird stuff would happen. Everyone in my family did hear it, and we talked about it, but no one had an explanation. I was recently out of college and was planning on moving into an apartment with my best friend, and was now looking at a time to step up efforts in finding a place. Not that I was afraid to be in my house, but like I said, things were getting weird. I had a bunch of weight equipment in the basement as well as a heavy bag. When I finally realized I should get my own place, it was when my heavy bag had been taken down from the hook in the ceiling of our basement, and I found it lying on my bed when I got home from work. My parents were actually out of town when this happened, and there was no way in hell my little sister was going to pick up that monster, drag it up 2 flights of stairs, and then flip it onto my bed. I have no idea how that happened, but I realized it was time to go. I should note at this point, nothing like this has ever happened in our house. It was just a typical home built in the 80s in the suburbs, and it looks like every third house on the street. It was a nice place. I had a great time growing up there, but things were just odd now. My friend and I had found a place that was exactly what we needed. A 2-bedroom upper in a decent part of town near everything that we wanted to be near. The grocery store, short drives to work, it was close to our gym, all that kind of thing. We were totally stoked to have our own place, and we were eager to move in. I packed up most of my stuff, but was leaving some things back in my house as obviously I couldn't take everything right away. A bunch of our friends helped us move in, and we had a party that night to celebrate. And that's what you do with friends when you help them move, right? You give them pizza and beer, and the world is a great place. After having a few too many, though, I fell asleep in my bedroom on an unmade bed and woke up to a sound of tapping on my window. I opened my eyes and looked at my watch. It was 4:30 a.m. At first I thought it was just a bird, but when I looked over at my window, the shades were up and there was nothing there. When I looked at the window, the tapping stopped, so I closed my eyes and just tried to go back to sleep. Immediately, the tapping started again, so my eyes opened, and this time the tapping didn't stop. I slowly got up and went over to the window, and the tapping continued. I even put my hand onto the glass and could feel something physically tapping on it. In my mind I was saying, this is impossible. We're on the 2nd floor of this place with nothing above us other than a roof, and the owners of the house downstairs. Finally, there was one loud bang on the window. The tapping stopped, and I just stood there looking out onto the street, not knowing what had just happened. I knew that it was not in my imagination when I had put my hands on the glass. I went out to the kitchen and got a glass of water, and went to the bathroom and then went back to my room. Thank God the next day was a Sunday and I didn't have to work. I could sleep in and spend the day unpacking the rest of my stuff. I woke up around 9, and my roommate, I should say his name is Jeff, said, "Hey, how you feeling, homeboy?" I said fine. I'd made sure to pound some Gatorade before I crashed the night before, and then had some water during the night. He just smiled, grunted, and asked if I wanted to go to a local diner for some breakfast. I said sure. We got cleaned up and left. After some food and coffee and a slow start to the day, we got back to our apartment. The cable guy was supposed to be coming out, and for a Sunday appointment, we didn't want to miss that. I started emptying all the boxes of clothes and putting them in my dresser, or just hanging them up in my closet. The doorbell rang, and I went to let the cable guy in. Jeff was busy in his room doing the same thing I was. I was talking with the worker as he made sure the existing lines were good to go, and then he asked to check the other 2 outlets in my room and Jeff's. I was walking back to my room and yelled for Jeff to check his TV, and then stopped dead in my doorway. All of the clothes I had hung up, laid out on my bed, and I'd soon find out put away in my dresser, were now back in their boxes that I had brought them in. I just stood there wide-eyed as Jeff came walking over and asked what was up. I didn't say anything, just flicked on my TV and saw that the cable was working. We walked out to the cable guy and told him that we were all set. He left, and then I told Jeff what had happened, and then about the tapping on my window the night before. At first he laughed and asked if I had maybe smoked some super skunk weed the night before, but then he got serious when I didn't laugh. "You believe in ghosts, dude?" he asked. I said I didn't know, but what was going on was really strange. He got up and grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge and sat back down, and I told him about the things that were happening at my house and the weird stuff that had been going on before we moved in here. Jeff looked at me and said, "You know, I saw this movie where a family had all this crazy shit going on in their house, but everywhere they went, the ghost or whatever followed them around. You think that something's following you?" I shrugged, finished my beer, and just said, "I don't know, but I know what I saw, and all this stuff is really happening." We kind of just let our conversation drift, and I got back to getting our place settled and got the boxes out and stuff. For a month or so, nothing out of the ordinary happened, and I started to forget about it, but the weirdness was still bouncing around in the back of my head. Then, more funny things started happening. Like, I'd get home from work or the gym before Jeff, and our front door would be wide open. I was always the last to leave in the morning, and I always locked the door. And I don't mean it was just unlocked. I mean the door was wide open. This happened about 5 times. I checked with the landlord, but he hadn't been up there. Then the door started opening at night when we were both home. One time it did it right in front of us while we were playing Tekken on my PlayStation. Jeff was getting as freaked out as me now, and things were escalating. We started to hear people or whatever walking around at all hours of the day when no one else was there. Windows and doors would open by themselves, and the tapping on my window at night got louder and louder. Both Jeff and I went back to the landlord downstairs and told him what was going on, but he didn't really have anything to share with us. We didn't really come right out and say we had a ghost or whatever, but we could tell he thought we were a little odd about things. He'd just shake his head and say there were no problems with his place, and he'd had plenty of tenants upstairs that never complained. This is when I found the little box. It had been placed in a cardboard box that I didn't realize my uncle had set aside for me. The little container was still sealed and had the note about not disturbing it. I threw caution to the wind, broke the wax seal, and the container was empty. I mean, there was nothing in it at all. That night was intense. We heard footsteps and a kind of wailing, a soft wailing, but like a woman crying in our kitchen. The next morning, Jeff and I talked about things, and I leveled with him about the container. While we're not superstitious, I mentioned that maybe I should try to put it back, as it wasn't supposed to have been removed from my grandparents' house in the first place. My uncle had just made a mistake. So this set forth an embarrassing conversation with the new homeowners of my grandparents' place. The young guy and his wife were in the process of a bunch of renovations when I stopped over and introduced myself. I'd concocted a BS story about leaving a toy soldier in the basement that I forgot to take when we sold the place, and I made out like it was really sentimental. I asked if I could go get it, and the couple were very sweet and said of course I could grab it if I knew where it was. They went back to painting the kitchen and the upstairs hallway, and I went down into the basement. I put the container back in the eaves where I had first found it. I took out a toy tin soldier from my pocket that I had brought along and went back upstairs to complete the ruse. I wished the couple luck with their house, and they said they were glad that I found the toy soldier. They had noticed it in my hand, and they hadn't noticed it downstairs. Things at our apartment stopped immediately. No more noises, no more footsteps. The doors and windows never opened on their own again for the next 2 years we lived there. Nothing happened, and nothing happened at my house where my parents still lived either. I'm seriously not a superstitious guy, and I hate to think I believe in ghosts or the paranormal, but all of that happened, and I have no explanation as to why that stuff went on. I mean, why the heck would a little empty metal box cause such a pain in the ass for me? And why did it focus on me? Was it just because my uncle had mistakenly put it in my box of keepsakes? I guess I'll never know. Since then, nothing out of the ordinary has ever happened to me, and I hope it stays that way. Demons Attacking by Fate Did It All. My story is pretty long and messed up. It's probably all my fault. I've always been interested in everything beyond the veil. I got my first set of tarot cards at 13, and I've always seen dark shadows and UFOs. When Ancient Aliens came out, I was obviously intrigued and soaked up any bit of information I could on the subject, including learning about women who mated with 4D light beings. I learned that I needed to become a medium to talk to these aliens, and that's what I did. The house we lived in at the time was over 120 years old, and sometimes we would hear a deep growling sound coming from the walls. One night my husband and I heard it yell at our newborn baby to shut up. Sometimes we would hear it walking around the house, and one night it threw a heavy cast iron pan across the kitchen. We decided to move when we found a burned bandana sitting in the middle of the basement. It was clearly meant as a threat. After the move, I got more heavily into this New Age spirituality. I obtained what I thought was a spirit guide who appeared to me every night as a purple mist. It was clearly a man. He spoke to me, gave me images of flowers and feelings of love and sexual energy. At one point, this spirit told me I needed to write him a love letter dedicating myself to him and to sign it in blood. He gave me a symbol to write on it, which I have since learned is a symbol for Satan. My husband saw him too sometimes, but he always gave my husband anger and hate, showing his face and telling him that I was cheating on him. I have never even considered that. My psychic powers were very good. I did readings on a regular basis, and I was told I was spot on every time. Sometimes as I meditated, he showed me symbols to draw and taught me how to do Reiki before I even knew what it was. He told me it was psychic energy healing, and with his help, I practiced on my husband. One night, my husband was working late, and I was laying in bed meditating with the spirit guide, and it raped me. I became paralyzed, and it fondled my body. It felt like static electricity running down my neck, around my breasts and bottom, and I felt it play with my lady parts, and it finished with quick penetration. I became very alarmed at that point, and somehow broke through the paralysis screaming, "No!" This was not the first time it had physically touched me, but it was the first and only sexual assault. All the while, my husband and I were having dreams of being sexually assaulted by random people. I'd never had sexual dreams before this, and now it happens once a month, and I'll explain that later. I will add my husband and I were having significant marital problems because of the anxiety and anger this thing made my husband feel. We didn't realize at the time it was psychic attacks. After this, I was afraid. I trapped the spirit in a salt trap using a candle and called a local medium to help me get rid of it. The medium came to my house and told me I had a spirit husband who was very beneficial to me, but that the spirit hated my husband and would do anything it could to tear us apart. They opened a door and had me tell it to leave. It stayed away for about a month, but then came back. I think it came back because I was still practicing mediumship and energy healing. 2 months later, I had a miscarriage that turned my whole world upside down. After the miscarriage, the activity increased. My husband and I would randomly hear a baby crying, and we would run to our son's room thinking it was him, but he was always sound asleep. I had visions of a baby and once had a dream of myself lying naked on a cold metal table with an alien baby. Sometimes I would feel the weight of a child in our bed as I listened to the crying, and I developed significant depression, and my husband sought therapy for his anxiety. We eventually bought a house and moved away, but everything followed us. We would hear little feet running upstairs while our son was asleep, and at one point my husband saw an apparition of a toddler in our son's room. My 4-year-old doesn't sleep through the night. He always says, "The ghosts are bothering me." I tell him ghosts aren't real. But he told me once, the ghost told him, "This is my bed. Get your hands off my toys." We also continued to see the purple mist. I saged the house and bought each of us onyx stones to protect us. I tried to psychically close all of the portals in our home and bodies to no avail. Obviously, only God was powerful enough to protect us. I turned to the Bible because now things were affecting my son. I learned whatever I was doing was against God's word, and I threw out everything occult-related and never practiced mediumship again. We pray as a family multiple times a day and have repented. My relationship with my husband has greatly improved, and we have fully dedicated ourselves to Christ. But the purple mist and the shadow toddler are still here. I need to mention, too, my husband and I have been trying to have another baby for 2 years, but have come down with unexplained infertility. All of our levels are normal, and we continue to have rape dreams, always on the day I ovulate. We still experience those psychic attacks. A few days ago, my husband saw the purple mist while falling asleep. It attacked him and punched him in the face, and then he fell asleep and had a dream where he was attacked, and the person told him, "What will you do once I take everything from you?" He fought and won, but still, we can't get rid of these things. They're attacking my family, not allowing us to fall pregnant, and I fear for my son. I wonder if we somehow conceived one of these weird spirit babies and have been marked for our involvement in the occult, even though we were ignorant. I'm open to any suggestions. My Paranormal Property, submitted by Anonymous. I guess I'll start with a backstory. I grew up going back and forth from staying with my mom and going to my dad's every other weekend. My dad's house was a trailer set on 5 acres of land. My grandparents put it there as a vacation home when they were younger. It had 3 rooms, which eventually turned into 2 rooms after my dad knocked down the wall between the 2 small rooms to give me a bigger bedroom. When you walked in the front door, you walked right in the living room and kitchen. The kitchen was at one end of the trailer and had a window that looked out to a little flower basket thing. I'm not really sure what to call it. We never even planted anything there because the windows were old and you had to crank them open, and that window would open only about 2 inches. Once you walked through the living room, you got to the hallway, and my room was right there on the left, and then you'd get to the bathroom, that unfortunately didn't have a door for the longest time. At the end of the hallway was my dad's room, and there was no door. I guess none of the rooms had doors because mine didn't either. Before I was born, when my mom and dad were dating, they had gone to Walmart to grab a few things for the weekend. The closest store was the Walmart, about 25 minutes away. At the time, they had 2 dogs, which were American Pit Bull Terriers. I know what people picture when you say the word pit bull, but let me fix that for you. My dogs were smaller. The biggest one, I'll call her H. She was only about 50 pounds when fully grown. She was my mom's dog, and she was super jealous once I was born. My other dog, whom everyone says was my dog because once I was born no one else mattered except me, which I know made my dad a bit jealous because he rescued her from a man who had shot her with buckshot. At her prime, she only weighed about 35 pounds. I'll call her O. They lived in pens outside, which they were much happier in because they were able to run around. So, my mom and dad had gotten groceries and dog food from Walmart. They got back when it was dark, so they carried in all the groceries and were putting everything away. My dad went to make the dogs a bowl of food. They couldn't find the dog food. So my dad went to the car and checked for it there. Couldn't find it. So he checked inside again, and my mom was now looking for it too. My dad even went to the dog pens to make sure he hadn't brought it out there and set it down. The dog food was nowhere to be found. My dad was a bit frustrated because the dogs had to eat, so that meant he had to drive all the way back to town to Walmart. So my parents hopped in the car and went, and they bought more. They got back home, fed the dogs, and then headed to bed. The next morning, when Mom and Dad were in the kitchen, I'm told Mom told my dad to look, and she pointed out the window where the flower basket was. And there was the bag of dog food, just sitting in the flower basket. There's no way they could have put it there because, like I said, the window only opened about 2 inches, and the driveway and walkway to get to the front door was on the other side. You didn't even walk past that side of the house to get to the front door. A few years later, I was born, and I was still a baby, so my mom had bought me a new pack of bottles so she could keep some there instead of bringing a few from my grandma's house, which is where me and my mom lived on weekdays and weekends when I wasn't with my dad. She went to get me a bottle, and the bag was nowhere to be found, and yes, maybe my dad had put them somewhere when he was at work, and it was very unlikely. After looking for them for well over 15 minutes, she called my dad to ask if he had seen them. He said no, so she just ended up using the one from my diaper bag. A few years later, my mom and dad had broken up, so she was packing up some of her stuff, and there, in the back of the closet, was a bag of bottles. She was so confused because they had cleaned out the closet a few months prior when they were moving their summer clothes out and putting their winter clothes in. Later, when I was about 5, my mom and dad started dating again, so she would come up with me on the weekends and we would spend the weekend together with my dad. Those are some of my favorite memories with my mom because on Saturdays my dad would work for a few hours. It was just me and my mom. We would go on walks together and she would help me climb the tree in the backyard. My mom has now passed away, and I look back on all those memories we made up there on that property. My mom had narcolepsy, but it was at its worst during the day, because at night she was always awake. She was a night owl, and I think that's why I am now one too. One night, me and my dad were asleep, and she was in the living room watching a Jeff Dunham DVD. She and H were sitting on the couch when H's fur on her back started to stand up. My mom said she got the chills, and H turned and looked at the entrance of the hallway, and when my mom looked up, she said she saw her friend standing there giving her a thumbs up. The thing that makes it so strange is the fact that her friend had passed away a few years prior in a car accident. My mom said he was only there for a second, and then he was gone. My mom was very open to the idea of the paranormal, and that's why I believe in ghosts. My personal experience happened when I was about 8. It was a weekend when it was just my dad and I, and it was around Christmas, so even at night my dad left on the Christmas tree lights. It was late because I was sleeping, and I woke up and the DVD I'd been watching before I fell asleep was Scooby-Doo. When I woke up, it was on the menu screen, which meant all the episodes had played. My bed was up against the wall at this time, so I could look out of my door and see into the living room, but I was only able to see the rocking chair because it was at an angle. My eyes eventually adjusted to the slight amount of light coming from the Christmas tree and from my TV. I was able to see the side of someone sitting in the rocking chair. She was wearing a lightly colored nightgown and had brownish hair. I remember I wasn't scared because I was able to fall back asleep, but the next day my dad had to work, so he brought me to my grandpa's house. I told him what had happened the night before, and when I was telling him the story, he looked confused when I was saying what this person looked like. He stood up and walked to his room and pulled out a few pictures and showed me a picture of my grandma. I'd never seen a picture of her, which I know sounds super strange, but my grandpa never kept pictures of her up because I think it made him sad even after all the years that she had passed. My dad and uncles didn't keep any pictures of her up either because they didn't want my grandpa to be sad when he came over. In the picture he had shown me, she was wearing a lightly colored nightgown. She had just started to get sick before cancer really took over her body. I think we see people that have passed for a reason. Like, I believe that my mom saw her friend because my dad and my mom had been fighting, and he was letting her know that she was going to be okay, and that's why he gave her a thumbs up. I'm not sure why I saw my grandma that night, but I do share the same middle name, and I was the first girl born into the family because she had 3 boys, and then the first 3 uncles my uncles had were boys. She wanted a daughter so bad, I think she was just happy to know that there was finally a girl in the family, and maybe she was making sure my dad was doing a good job at raising me. I'm happy I was able to see her since I wasn't lucky enough to get to meet her. I know my story isn't very scary, and I could talk about the time someone tried to break into the trailer when we weren't home. My dogs were in a crate inside because it was winter, and H broke out of her crate to defend the house. Thankfully, they didn't get in, but the window was cracked, and they did break into the shed and stole my drum set. And that's all I really know about that. The trailer is now abandoned because my dad is living with my grandfather now because he has early signs of dementia and needs someone there to check on him. I've gone up to the property a few times recently, and I've had a few fires, and actually that's what my current boyfriend and I did on our first date. We went up there, had a bonfire, and we've done that multiple times since. My boyfriend has even put up a tire swing in the backyard for me because I'm still a child at heart. And on my mom's birthday, he drove me out there because he knows that me and my mom shared some good memories out there. I hope that one day I can build a small little house on that property so my children can grow up there and spend time riding four-wheelers and exploring the woods behind the house like I did as a child. Demonic Entity, submitted by Chrissy R. I recently found your YouTube channel, and after catching up on videos, I feel this is a safe place to share one of my life happenings. I was raised in upstate New York by abusive parents. Over the years, I've had some strange happenings, but the scariest was a set of events that happened when I was 16. Several times at night after my parents abused me, I would see this 7-foot figure in a black hooded cloak. Each time it would get closer, until one night it was right by my bed. I woke up to the feeling of being choked, and I opened my eyes to this thing pulling on my necklace so tight I felt like it was choking. Its hood fell back, and I was staring into these evil red eyes and a very inhuman face. I couldn't scream, and I couldn't move. I don't know what made it let me go, but when it finally did, I ran out of the room as fast as I could. I've had more encounters with this thing over the years, and it's always after an incident of abuse. I think it feeds off what is being done to me. Thanks for reading this if you do. Scary Ouija Board Experience by Simon. About 6 weeks ago, I was at my friend Doug's. He was at work at the time, so we were chilling and we were waiting for him to come back. The girls had played on a Ouija board earlier that day and appeared rather shaken up. And seeing this, 2 friends and I somehow managed to talk the girls into participating again. We wanted to feel the buzz they were feeling, so we started to play and said some chants before we continued. For about half an hour, one of my friends thought it was funny to screw it up by talking and pushing the glass around when he shouldn't. We think it was because he was scared of what might happen, but then again, that's the buzz. We kicked him off the board and started again. We all placed our finger on the Ouija board and asked if anyone was there. After about 5 minutes, the glass slowly started to grind towards yes. It finally highlighted the word yes and slowly grinded back to the center. We then asked who he or she was. It started to the word open, got there, then moved back toward the middle. We asked the same question 3 times after that, and in conclusion it spelled out the words, "Open, you give." We were confused, and shortly after these questions, weird things started to happen. The computer in the room started booting and rebooting so fast it was impossible. There's no computer which I've seen in my life which can boot up and shut down, then reboot again 10 times within the spacing of 5 seconds. The light started to flicker slightly and gradually increased its intensity. Also, a bowl on the table started to grind around very slowly on its own. Observing this, I started to feel the buzz. The girls, however, were getting scared and wanted to leave. They said that this didn't happen when they played it. Now the next bit that happened is the bit that scared me. Kylie, the girlfriend of my mate, owns a dog. It's a foxy, so it's a rather small dog, not capable of much damage. It's a very friendly dog. I, in fact, have never even seen it bark at anyone in anything less than a playful tone. His tail was always wagging, but now the dog was acting unusual. It was pacing quickly up and down the hallway in the midst of what was happening. Then all of a sudden, very quickly and violently, went to attack Kylie's neck. He didn't do any damage, but then proceeded to just keep pacing. And at this point, I knew something was wrong. We all wanted to leave, so we asked if he or she would grant us permission to leave, and it answered with what I expected. No. We asked again and pleaded, and once again it said, no. So we tried another tack. We asked if we could leave one by one, asking for people to leave at individual turns. It agreed. One by one, it let us go. Except for one person, Luke. He asked to leave, and it said no 3 times. On the 4th time, it said wait. He asked a 5th time, and it very slowly grinded halfway to yes. There it paused for like 5 minutes, and eventually moved to yes. About 4 or 5 seconds after this, one of the girls screamed and said there was something in my friend's traveling bus. It was dark, but you could see something moving inside the bus due to the streetlight shining through the windows on the other side. Knowing everything that I had previously witnessed, I believed them, and we all avoided the bus. I could sense a very strong, uneven presence focused on me every time I looked at that thing. I stopped looking at the bus because I didn't like that feeling. One of the girls, about 10 minutes after that, said she saw something head into the reserve behind my friend's house rather quickly. I have to cross the reserve to get home. It was about 12 a.m., and not knowing whether it really was something evil or good, or maybe even just a cat or a dog, I decided to use my friend's bike to ride the long way home. I was taking the streets because I felt a bit more safe that way. I still had a very scary, unsafe feeling, and felt like something was following me the whole way home. I was moving as quickly as I could, as you can imagine, so whatever I thought was following me would have had to really shift to keep up. I got home really scared and went to bed with the light on. I still felt an uneven presence, so I said a prayer. After this, I felt the presence lift and was able to fall asleep. But the next morning, more weird stuff started to happen. I woke up to get ready for school, and the radio switched itself on. It flicked rapidly through stations, and loudly and clearly I heard, "Do you feel like something evil is about to happen to you? Well, it just might." Then nothing. Just static. It was one of those really cheesy advertising voices that make you want to punch the guy in the face, but at the time it scared the hell out of me. I took a shower, and I turned on the radio in the shower to experiment with what just happened. And I turned it on, and there was nothing but static. I moved my hand toward the radio, and the second I touched it, it worked. I took my hand away, and static. I placed my hand back up on the radio, it worked, and so on. I didn't really mind at the moment because I found that interesting. I played it off as something scientific or something like that. But a few other weird things happened to me, but nothing that couldn't be proved scientifically. I told my dad about everything that had happened, and he told me that things might get weirder and scarier, but he would help me and protect me. The following night after I talked to my dad at roughly 2 or 3 in the morning, I was just laying in bed not being able to sleep. Outside my door is material going down the hallway to line the floor and to prevent the white carpet from getting dirty. At the bottom of my bedroom door there's a small piece of material, and it rests on the outside. It slightly dims the light that comes from under the door, but you can still see the light under it. If anyone walks past my door, I can see if the lights are on in the room, because the shadow moves past the door, blocking the light temporarily. As I said, I was lying down, staring in that general direction, and I started to hear these weird sounds. I stared directly at the bottom of the door to see if anyone was there. I didn't expect anything, but 3 or 4 seconds after the sounds, a shadow moved past the door, and the light coming through the door increased greatly. I walked over to my door, absolutely dreading it, but I needed confirmation that this wasn't normal. I knew there was definitely something in my hallway because the material was scuffed, which is why the light coming through the bottom of the door increased. I knew something really was there. The other scary thing that I forgot to mention was that it paused for a second right outside my bedroom door before continuing on. I went to my sister's bedroom, and she was out cold. I checked by shaking her. She still didn't wake up, so I was satisfied with that and continued to my dad's room. I opened the door and checked if he was asleep, and he was too. I needed to wake him up and tell him what just happened, and I did it, but with difficulty. Together, then we searched the house intensely. I had a meat cleaver because, once again, I felt that same scary, uneven presence. We didn't find anything, but I knew there was something there, and it knew which bedroom was mine. Thankfully, I have not had any more encounters. From my observations, I've found that each encounter has been more intense than the last, and I'm dreading the fact that I might actually come face to face with whatever this thing is. I won't back down, though, because I believe that if I run, it will just follow me. Family Scare, submitted by Ace of Bassoon. Q, this is going to be long before I even begin. After my first child turned 5 and was in kindergarten, my husband and I decided to move our house from our country seat to a unique neighborhood in Chicago called Logan Square. It was a big difference from what we were used to, but I no longer was going to be commuting downtown. I was going to do the stay-at-home mom thing, and my husband, who traveled a lot as a corporate interpreter, could get to O'Hare or Midway for his regular flights. It was roughly halfway between the two. We fell in love with the place right away, and were thrilled to win a bidding war with another young couple for the keys, as they say. It was a 2-story place with a huge front porch and a decent-sized backyard for our kids. One of the first things we did was put up a garish playhouse for our daughter Elsie, and my next child that I was expecting in just a few months. The front yard was short to the street, but I was determined to put a garden in the front, and there was a nice garage with space for a shop above it for my husband. But access to that was via an alley that ran between the next street over and ours. All in all, it was a great place, and we were very happy. After my son was born, Jack, my husband got his superiors to get him some work locally for a while so he could be home to be easier on me and their newborn son. I should say here that my husband's name is John. It was October, but I was already looking forward to the next spring and summer. I was dreaming of walks and being outside with my kids. Jack slept in our room in a bassinet until he outgrew that, and tearfully I had to move him into his own little room that we had decorated just for him. We'd purchased this cool camera audio monitor system so we could keep an eye on him and hear him, and it was even hooked up to our phones. It's pretty neat, but it would also be the way we first found out that something strange was going on. Shortly after we moved Jack into his room, we started to hear things over the baby monitor. We could see him sleeping peacefully, but there were these noises that we just couldn't explain coming from his room. My husband would be watching a ball game and I'd say, "Hey, honey, listen to this." He's a diehard Cubby fan and would get annoyed at first, but then when he'd sit down next to me, we'd hear this whispering in what sounded like Jack's closet door opening and shutting. John would run up to the room and I'd hear him quietly going in there, but there was nothing ever there. Through the monitor, I could see him leaning over Jack's crib to check on him, and then leaving him there sleeping peacefully. This started to become a nightly occurrence, but only in the nursery. At this point, nothing was ever happening to Elsie, and nothing else happened anywhere else in the house. Jack was never harmed or scared, and we kind of just put it out of our heads as house-settling noises. At the end of that January, John had to make a business trip to New York, so my mother came to stay with me and the kids for a couple of days. Elsie was talking non-stop about getting out of preschool and going to kindergarten, and it was just nice to have my mom with me for a little while. My parents lived in Asheville, North Carolina, so outside of holidays we didn't get to see them as much as we wanted. Not that it makes a difference, but my husband was an orphan and grew up in the foster system. To this day, we don't know who his parents are. But anyway, back to the story. The first night he was gone, John and I FaceTimed so he could see the kids and chat with me and my mom. Mom had actually taken Jack upstairs to put him down for the night while Elsie prattled on about school before she had to go to sleep. She was sitting up in her bed and John was going to read her a bedtime story when my mom came into the room white-faced and clearly shaken. I asked her what was wrong, and she just shook her head and said, "Not now, later." She then went downstairs, and I didn't know what to think. We got Elsie taken care of, and she drifted off pretty quick. I told John I'd call him back and went to find my mom, and she was in the kitchen making tea. Before I could even say anything, she looked at me and said, "What's going on in Jack's closet? Do you have a radio or something in there?" I said, "No, of course not." But she said she could hear voices coming from it when Jack fell asleep. She opened the door, and the whispering that she had heard stopped. I came clean and told her about the stuff we'd been experiencing too. I tried to brush it off, and my mom said, maybe I just heard some people walking by outside. As I mentioned, our front yard isn't that far from the sidewalk. It was completely possible that that's what was happening. I told John about it later when I called him, and he agreed and said that's probably what we'd been hearing before as well. The next night, though, I woke up at about 2 a.m. to hear my daughter talking in her room. I went in and saw her standing at her window looking into our backyard and saying things like, "I don't know," and "I can't play outside right now." I finally asked her who she was talking to. She just turned to look at me and smiled. "Shouldn't you be sleepy, I said, picking her up and putting her back into bed. She just giggled and said, "That man is funny," before going back to sleep. I looked out into our snowy backyard, and for a second, I swear I thought I saw a black shadow, the shape of a man, standing next to our wooden playset. I then reassured myself that it was probably just a trick of the light outside, and would ask Elsie what she had seen in the morning. In the morning, I did ask her about what she'd seen, and she just kept referring to this person as her friend, the funny man. My mother looked at me from over her cup of coffee and shook her head. I had already told her what had happened the night before. John was coming home that day, and my mom was going to stay for another couple to just give us some time to get out and about and take care of some things. I went to pick him up at the airport and told him about what my mom had said and the other things, and he didn't take it as lightly as I did. My husband is extremely protective and somehow thought there might be a strange person lurking around our house talking to our daughter, even though that was impossible as she had never been out of my sight. We kind of got into a fight about it, but he couldn't figure out how something like this would get into her head. He was convinced there was somebody messing with us. We went to a grocery store, and then I needed to go to a boutique to return some clothing. And that's when we got a frantic call from my mother. She said there was this fluttering noise coming from Jack's nursery closet. She just laid him down for his afternoon nap, and she said he was going to sleep, but as she was leaving the room, she could actually feel the door shaking. She said it sounded like there was a giant bird in there. We said we'd be home right away, and John immediately thought that maybe there was a bird or a squirrel or a bat or something in the closet. We got home. He immediately went upstairs and checked, but there was nothing in there. Elsie, my mother had said, was continually looking out the back window of our dining room all day and asking her grandmother where her funny friend was, the funny man. This was getting creepy. That night, John and I sat down at our breakfast bar and had a talk about what was going on. We had obviously made up from our fight at that point, but he still had big concerns about our daughter seeing some man or thing in our backyard and thinking it was her friend. I mean, imaginary friends are one thing, but the way Elsie described it, it wasn't another child. This was some man. We also couldn't figure out and had to come to terms with the whispering we heard in the baby monitor in Jack's room and the strange sounds coming from the closet. We knew that our closet had access to our attic, but there was nothing like that in Jack's nursery, so it wasn't the wind and it wasn't anything coming from outside. I didn't want to go all Amityville horror because I loved our house and I knew that nothing sinister was really going on. But it was creepy and it was bordering on annoying. I mean, had it been what I read or hear on YouTube channel or things like little noises and objects moving around, I don't think I would have cared so much. But the fact that we did hear this whispering and our daughter was actively seeking out someone, it made us a little nervous. My mother went home and things got back to normal for the most part. John was continuing to work close to home, but that time was coming to an end in the next month or two. As the weather got nicer, I started to spend more time outside with my kids as the weather permitted. But I always had a strange feeling around that playset in the backyard. When things finally dried out and spring really sprung, Elsie was loving to play out there, and I would just sit on a blanket with Jack watching her play. What was strange, though, was when we were outside, my daughter never mentioned the strange figure, and I never saw a shadow either at nighttime or in the daytime again. The noises in Jack's room also stopped. One Saturday, a friend of ours came over for dinner with her new girlfriend, and it was a low-key dinner party. We just sat around the table eating steak and portobello mushrooms my husband had grilled up, and our friend's girlfriend made mention out of nowhere about our backyard. Her mutual friend immediately shot her a look as if to say, "What are you talking about? Shut up." But I was intrigued and said, "What do you mean?" The girlfriend mentioned that she was sensitive and felt like there was some presence in our backyard watching us as we just had our drinks and my husband grilled. Again, our friend was mortified, but I assured her that this actually makes sense. And that started off a huge conversation about the things that had been happening in our new home. The girlfriend asked if we felt threatened by anything, and I said no. I was just worried about my children as they were reacting to what was happening around them. Jack was still too little to understand much at that point, obviously, but we continued to talk about it, and John was very open to the conversation, which surprised me, as he's one of those no-nonsense skeptic kind of people. That's when Elsie came into the room and said that her friend wanted her to go outside and play. I immediately asked her what friend, and she just said, "The funny man." John took over and asked who she meant and where this man was. She pointed right out our dining room window and said, "He's looking at us right now, Daddy." All 4 sets of eyes shot over to the window to see absolutely nothing, just the darkness of a late spring evening falling down. My husband looked at her and said, "Are you sure, honey? What does he look like?" Our daughter just said, "He's kind of wavy, but I can see him smiling. He's wearing a big hat. He just wants to play." Our friend's girlfriend stared at the window and said, "I see him." John took Elsie by the hand and took her out into the living room to read her some books, and at my cue he realized I wanted to continue to talk about what was actually happening here. Our friend's girlfriend continued to stare out the window for another couple of minutes before she looked back at us and said, "He's gone now." I pressed her about what he looked like, and she said he was dressed in clothing not from our lifetime. He was wearing a dark fedora and an old black boxy suit. She said he didn't look frightening, but said she was getting some kind of strange vibe. My brain went to the creepshow movies I had seen in the past, like Poltergeist and That Crazy Minister. Our friend's girlfriend assured me it wasn't anything like that kind of crazy, but it was something that we did need to handle. I asked her how that was going to be possible, and as soon as I asked her that, there came a thumping from upstairs in Jack's nursery. He was sitting in my lap at the time, and no one else was in the house. John immediately jumped up from the couch where he was reading with Elsie and ran upstairs. The thumping stopped when he got into the room, and I turned on my phone app, and I could hear him muttering under his breath as I heard him walking around the nursery. I heard him open the closet door and say, "Oh, for Christ's sake, just get out of here. You're not welcome. Stay away from my daughter and son." Again, this was so uncharacteristic of my husband. We all sat listening to him, and when he came back down, he was stone-faced and went right to Elsie to continue her book. The three of us continued to chat, trying to avoid that line of conversation for the rest of the evening, until Elsie and Jack went to bed. I eventually put Jack down. John read another book to Elsie after she had brushed her teeth and washed her face. He was also brushing her hair, and soon she was out like a light. We went back downstairs and sat with our friends and resumed our conversation. I could tell that our friend had told her girlfriend something that was probably along the lines of, "Would you please stop bothering these people? Stop telling them these fantastical tales." But I knew something was up and was appreciative of an audience. John poured some wine for the three of us, grabbed himself a drink, and sat down and bluntly said, "What do we do to get this out of here?" The friend suggested we smudge the house, which I know is a popular term with a lot of stories like this. I wasn't so sure that that would be a solution, but at this point I was ready to try anything. I didn't feel threatened, I can't stress that enough, but I just didn't want any of this strangeness happening in our new home anymore. John was up for anything and asked the woman to come back next weekend, and he would make sure that no one was home. I could take the kids out shopping or something, and he would be there to let her do whatever she thought could be done. Again, this was so strange and highly irregular of John. I actually had to hand it to him that he was willing to do anything and go to any lengths to protect his house, his family, and his kids. After our friends left, that night things went a little sideways. We heard more thumping from upstairs and then crashing. Then we heard Elsie wake up crying, so we both raced upstairs to see what was going on. The drawers in Elsie's dresser had opened up and crashed onto the floor. Her closet door was open and immediately shut when we entered the room and turned the lights on. She clearly was just waking up and didn't understand what was happening. She was rubbing her eyes. I ran to her, scooped her up and consoled her while John went into Jack's nursery and saw the same thing had happened there. He then went into our bedroom and found that our dresser drawers had also been dumped onto the floor. Whatever this was, it was not happy with our plan to ask whatever it was to leave. Jack slept through it all. John then told me to take Elsie downstairs and clean up the mess, and eventually we got our daughter to go back to sleep, but I said I was staying in the room with her. I was not leaving her in there for another return visit from whatever the heck this thing was. John went out onto the front porch with his phone, and I think he was talking to his best friend. He never did tell me who he was talking to, but he was out there for a while, and I think he was at his wit's end and didn't know what else to do. When Elsie fell asleep, I did take a minute to go downstairs, and I just saw him smoking a cigar, which was rare for him to do. I asked him if he was okay. He looked at me and said, "I love you very much. Things are going to be fine, I promise." The following week was uneventful. Elsie didn't mention the creepy figure once, and we didn't hear any more strange noises or experience anything weird in the house. John, however, followed through with the meeting with our friend's girlfriend that Saturday. This is getting really long. To make a long story short, we found out that this entity, or whatever it was actually more present in our garage in the room above it behind the house. We hadn't been out there that much due to just having to take care of the kids, and not much time for my husband to dabble in his hobbies. This friend smudged the house, and quite frankly, I have to be honest with everybody, it does not smell good. She then wanted to go outside and smudge our backyard, did the same thing all along the fence line, and then went into the garage. John told me later that when they went into the upstairs portion of the garage, she had the breath sucked out of her. He said that all she could say to him was, "He's here, he's here, he's here." It took a minute to gain her composure, but John said she got it together, smudged the room, and then smiled at John after saying a silent prayer. She said that she had wished the man to go and that he had other horizons to find. She was confident that he had heard her and understood and left. I know this all sounds unbelievably bizarre, like a really bad movie. For the next few years, nothing out of the ordinary happened at our house, and they were some of the greatest times I've ever had. John eventually was asked to transfer to California, and we decided it would be a smart move for us, as much as we loved living in Chicago. I mean, who can say no to awesome weather? While we were packing things up and getting things ready for the movers, the final thing happened in Jack's nursery. By now it was no longer a nursery, it was his room. He was growing up so fast. Elsie never mentioned the funny man again, but Jack did. About a week before we finally made our move to Southern California, Jack came downstairs from playing in his room and asked me if it was okay if he played with the funny man. I was taken aback and asked him what he looked like. He said he looked wavy and had a big hat on. He said he smiled and laughed a lot. I looked at Jack and said, "I don't think that's a good idea, and maybe you should just tell the funny man that he should leave." Funny little kid. Jack ran upstairs, and I could hear him muttering something. Then he ran back downstairs and said, "Okay, Mommy, I told him to go." That was the last we ever saw or heard of the funny man. Everything that we've experienced here in SoCal has been uneventful. Thank you for considering my story. Hey gang, thanks for listening to Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know some people aren't into the paranormal stuff, but I had so many submissions that I had to just make this special volume. If you'd like your story narrated on this channel, email unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Follow me on social media, links to that are in the description below, and I can't wait for the next episode to come out. I hope you're waiting for it too. Until then, everyone, be excellent to each other. And remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.